want to acknowledge the land that we're on. So maybe we can all take a deep breath, close our eyes, connect our feet to the ground, and acknowledge that we are on traditional lands. Here at Royal Roads University, we're so lucky to be on the ancestral land of the Lekwungen and Cosapson families and ancestors, also known as the Esquimalt and Songhe nations. So it's really with deep gratitude that we learn, play, work on those lands where Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people come together. So if you know the traditional lands you're joining us from today, please enter it in the chat. It's always fantastic to see where you're from. And again, thank you for being here. And I see more people coming. That's great. I'm just letting everybody in. So making sure everybody's in the good Zoom room today. We're here to talk about Child Rights Reimagined. And I'm here with Kathleen Manion, who is the program head at Royal Roads University. And I'll make sure to introduce Kathleen. She'll introduce you to the panelists, and she'll talk a little bit about Menti. That will be the Padlet and the information we're using today to communicate in the session. And my name is Nancy Prévost-Maurice. I'm an education specialist at Royal Roads University. So I'm doing student recruitment. If you have any question about the program, please let me know in the chat and I'll be in touch with you.
Wonderful.
And today's agenda, we're here for 60 minutes. We'll have the intro as we're doing now, panel discussion, and we'll answer questions at the end or throughout the session. And then I'll pass it over to you, Kathleen, if you want to introduce Menti.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Nancy. And it's wonderful to see so many people here. It is such a delight. So my name is Kathleen Manion. I am based at Royal Roads University on the wonderful and beautiful traditional lands of the Cosapson and Algonquin speaking families and ancestors. And what a delight it is to be here as well. I am so excited to be able to introduce this panel to you. But before we did that, we thought we would do a few things to keep you engaged. We only have an hour together, so we wanted to keep this as interactive as possible while also giving time to our panelists. So we have put up a Menti here. So if anyone has not used Menti, if you could go to www.menti.com and it'll ask you for a code. The code is here.
Sorry, Kathleen, I think you muted yourself, maybe. I can't hear you.
Okay, I did. My apologies. I'm not sure where I cut off there, but I'm asking you to go to Menti, www.menti.com, and use the code that's there. I've also put it in the chat function. Simple question here. We're looking at a word cloud. Simple question. In reimagining child rights, what one thing would you change or add? So we'll have a little bit of a collective look at what we're thinking there while I introduce the panel. Before I get started in doing that, I just wanted to introduce this concept of this session, really looking at how can we reimagine child rights. Of course, we have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is such a fantastic instrument in many ways, but we are 30 plus years since it's been introduced. And really, it's time for us to see how can we better look at children's rights? What more can we put into this framework? This is a legal instrument. It has legal ramifications, but it's also important to recognize that it also has really profound social and political agency, and we could better use that, particularly to look at some of the gaps that we haven't been so good at looking at participatory rights. How can we further those? How can we decolonize some of the language and some of the efforts within this space in research and education and activism? And how can we better understand how children are actually situated in their families, their communities, but also within the physical environment? And with that, I want to introduce our lovely panelists, who I have had the privilege of working with all of them in different capacities. So we have Doris Kakuru, who is an associate professor at the University of Victoria. He's going to talk a little bit about research and participatory approaches and different ways of privileging children's voices. We have Rebeccah Nelems who's currently at McGill University, but is also an associate faculty member at Royal Roads University, who's going to talk more about children's activism within environment and climate action. And Natasha Blanchet-Cohen, who is professor at Concordia University, and I know her students are with us. So we also thank Concordia for jointly sharing Natasha, who has recently come on a visiting scholar here at Royal Roads University, but is normally situated at Concordia. And I just going to check in before I hand over to Natasha. I'm just going to check in at our Menti word cloud. I'm going to share this screen. Sorry, Nancy, I'm going to stop sharing your screen and share this to look at what we have collectively said about reimagining child rights. So with that, actually, I'm going to pass it to Natasha, who can also talk to some of the things that we're seeing on the screen before we also share her slides.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Kathleen, and everybody for organizing this session. Gosh, I'm loving these words that I'm seeing in the word cloud. I'm going to speak to some of them: collective, environment, diversity. So I'm calling from Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal. I'm located at Concordia University on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. I recognize this, the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which I live and work. What I wanted to share with you today. So do I go on or do I comment on the word clouds? No, I'm gonna go on, but we'll come back to the word clouds maybe. So what I wanted to share with you today was some of the broad strokes of an article that we are just in the midst of publishing, and it's upcoming in a Brazilian journal, that is entitled Reimagining Children's Participatory Rights with Decolonial Learning. So the very title of this talk today. And I wanted to set some of the theoretical foundations, sort of set the stage or a stage for some of the conversations that we're going to be having today. I'd like to acknowledge that this paper was written with two other colleagues of mine, Holly Doyle-Mackaway from Macquarie University in Australia, and Emmy Cooper, who's a PhD student and a human rights education practitioner, and who's on the call today as well. So collectively, we've been working for over 2 decades around children's rights. But this article really emerged from a reflection that's been really galvanized by recent events in the context of the pandemic, for instance, so the Black Lives Matters movement, Every Child Matters movement, and our own experiences in engaging in decolonizing research and decolonizing organizations. And although we've been we're super adamant and advocates of children's rights, we've kind of been compelled to pause and to reflect more critically on children's rights. And I think that has been done quite a lot generally in terms of human rights education, but less the case in respect to children's rights. So the image that I'm going to offer you today is kind of this is an image, a mural that was taken in Ireland several years ago, but it's kind of this idea of working together, the need to work together in terms of making children's rights a reality and to reimagine. So there's this kind of this castle in a distance collectively about how we can be more responsive to children's voices in a changing society. So coming back to the title around what is decolonial learning. So that was the first piece that we, maybe just leave that image. Or actually, you can take it out, the image for now, because I'm going to come back to the other one after. That's great. So what is decolonial learning? So we drew on the literature, and I'm not going to give you all the authors, you can read the paper later, but our understanding of decolonial learning is that it has 2 components. One is just uncovering the ways that knowledge production has been perpetuated through colonialism, racist policies, and so forth. And certain knowledges have been privileged at the expense of others. The other aspects of decolonial learning is also exploring alternative possibilities of thinking and doing. So it's with that mindset that we engaged in this discussion around participatory rights. One of the key elements of that is really considering dialogue as being really important in terms of enabling that transformation and renewal. And within that dialogue, considering children as knowledge holders and exploring with them alternative epistemological traditions and narratives. And as an example of some of these kind of concepts that in children's rights we've kind of taken as like given but never questions, like just to mention a few, the fact that, you know, there's this cutoff age of children and adulthood at the age of 18, whereas we know lots of research supports that it's much more fluid, this concept of age, and it changes depending on societies. The overemphasis that is being played on child protection as opposed to children's participation. And so there's little recognition about some of the interconnections, the intergenerational aspects, and the relational components. So these are this sort of overemphasis of a binary dichotomous way of viewing the world has underpinned a lot of our approach to children's rights. And we, I think, acknowledge through our own work, we have been part of that process as well. So it's a really engaging and sort of a deconstruction piece that has been really very messy at times and very demanding, but I think is very is encouraging us to move forward. So our next step was, how are we going to go about looking at children's rights? You know, children's rights is big, there's many articles. So our starting place for that has been looking at the guiding principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so very briefly, this is the type of questions that we have been engaging in and that we engage in our article. So take the article, the principle on non-discrimination, Article 2, that deals with the right to diversity, respect for age, sex, and genders and identities. Usually we only consider one of those aspects, but within a decolonial lens, it really encourages us to take a much more intersectoral approach to considering diversity, considering the multiple identities of young people and how they intersect with their context. Human rights educators have inadvertently often embodied practices that only focus on one aspect of identity, and rather than engaging in some of that complexity, they've often celebrated diversity and not necessarily put in light some of the complexities and uphold that diversity. So it does raise a whole bunch of different set of skills and the way that we're working as youth workers. Another article, Article 3 around best interest, when we've been looking at it from a decolonial learning perspective, one element, and there's many others, but at least this is the one that we dwelt within this article, was recognizing that a lot of the discussion around best interest focuses from an individual perspective and doesn't necessarily consider that children are part of social groupings and the collective belonging from which they come from, and how do we work with communities in considering best interests, which definitely raises a whole bunch of other approaches in terms of working with and supporting the best interest of the child. The other article the other guiding principle is Article 6 on life, survival, and development. And obviously that article is like huge. But when we actually start looking at it, we're like, so how is development really understood? And what are the norms and the values that are being perpetuated when we're talking about development? When we look at it closely, I mean, I think a lot of development is actually underpinning the views of development, our views around commodification, extraction of land and resources. So how do we put that in context of the environmental crisis within which we are living today and that young people are actively engaged in? So if we're really going to put forward Article 6 on life, survival, and development, it would be really looking more at the view of young people as being care agents of the environment, perspectives that would emphasize much more strong ecological citizenship and centering children's social agency. So these elements are not discussed that much in the context of children's rights. There's like, it's it's somewhat there, but not necessarily in a prominent place. So a lot of the research that we were doing was drawing on this very disparate research in other disciplines and trying it to apply the tip of the iceberg. And maybe I'll give you my slide here. So my slide that I want to leave you with as we hear from the other speakers is this mural of that was done in Thunder Bay in a school of young people in Thunder Bay, in a school in Thunder Bay. And I really like it in terms of representing this idea that we are in a journey, like this unpacking and re-engaging in children's rights is a journey that has multiple layers. So you look at the picture and there's these eagles that have different that are coming up from different perspectives. And I think that's kind of what I would encourage us all as we revisit human rights in a spirit of renewal. I think it can encourage us to have a much more, a broader view on children's participation that also recognizes some of the traditional forms of participation that may have been omitted, but also considering a pluriversality in young people's multiple and dynamic roles that they play in their community and their context. So we end the article with a series of questions, that start with, the importance of locating yourself, questioning your own biases, looking at different forms of participation, and I'll maybe leave you with one of them. How can we encourage more interdisciplinary and intergenerational opportunities for knowledge sharing and knowledge production? So I think I'll pass it on now to Rebeccah, who will maybe ground us a little bit more in a practical, a recent experience that has dwelt into some of these questions that I've raised here.
Fantastic, Natasha. And just before Rebeccah starts, I just wanted to share also in the spirit of keeping this active and interactive, we have also put a Padlet within the chat function. So if you want to follow along with some of the questions, we've prompted a few questions in the Padlet for you to discuss in keeping with each of the four speakers. So with that, back to you, Rebeccah. Thank you.
Hi there, everyone. So nice to be here with you today. I'm joining you today from the ancestral lands of the Lekwungen and the Kusapsan peoples, also where Railroads is based. And I want to acknowledge and express my gratitude for the respectful relationships of care and reciprocity that these nations and families generate and have been embedded in for millennia with this incredibly beautiful ecosystem where I live currently as a sixth generation uninvited guest of Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and British descent. And I want in particular to acknowledge and express my gratitude for how witnessing and learning about these relational lifeways and those of other Coast Salish and Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island have profoundly shaped not only the research I do, but also the way I theorize about, understand, and experience the world. It's an honor to be part of the conversation this morning with all of you and with my fellow presenters. I'll dive into the particular offering that I hope to make this morning, which is to speak to a distinct form of diversity that I see being articulated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth climate justice activists, and that is ontological diversity, or diversity of worldviews, and the connection that these youth are making between ontological diversity and promoting and ensuring a genuinely deep diversity within the rights sector. I'll do this by highlighting the specific demands that one group of youth climate justice activists from across Turtle Island made at what they named the Phoenix Consultation, which was a consultation on the rights of young people to a healthy environment. And so I would just ask Nancy if you could share the first of my slides, please. So to offer context for you, the virtual Phoenix Consultation was the result of a multi-institutional collaboration that occurred over the course of 4 days back in July 2021. It was designed to inform the UN Special Rapporteur on young people's right to a healthy environment. All aspects of this consultation were guided and overseen by an intergenerational advisory committee, including young people from each of Mexico, the US, and Canada. And there was extensive preparatory work in the year leading up to it, including an academic committee made up of individuals from 15 different research institutions and universities across Turtle Island. Additionally, youth received training in youth participatory action research and conducted their own research, which they presented at the consultation. Dr. Kathleen Manion was a core collaborator in this training. And while it was a live synchronous training, we have a link for some core training modules available for youth. And they're available on the Railroad's website. So perhaps Kathleen or I will share that a little bit later in the chat for everyone. If you wouldn't mind changing the slide to the next one for me, Nancy, please. So as mentioned, one of the outputs of this consultation was a trilingual list of demands the young people co-created, and they created this in real time based on the inputs of all of the delegates there. And they were able to member check live in the session. And they called this the Phoenix Manifesto. And later on, I'll also put the link in the chat to the Phoenix consultation report, which includes the full manifesto, so you can see that. And every one of the participants' demands were infused with issues of diversity. For example, the first demand made, to quote their exact words, was to ground solutions across social and environmental movements in both the theory and practice of intersectionality. They said intersectionality clarifies the need for justice, and they argued that intersectionality is a tool for understanding how some identities are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, and how, just like an ecosystem, our differences are a strength and resource for climate justice and are necessary for the cogeneration of life. Throughout this manifesto, they speak about an intersectional collective. So I was very interested to see in the Wordle, or the word cloud created earlier, that collective was right in the center. But what I want to zero in on here is that the collective that they referred to and described was not just the group of youth participants at the consultation. It was not just young people, and it was not even just humans. Their collective, as they articulate it, includes all of nature. And so, Nancy, if you could change to the next slide. And so in their second demand, after they've clarified the centrality of intersectionality, they clarify that they're thinking also in terms of the rights of nature. And what I wanted to highlight here today is how this introduces a degree of ontological diversity, or diversity of worldviews, that I think is absolutely critical for us to be speaking about when we're talking about reimagining and re-envisioning children's rights. Here in this specific demand, they argue to transform rights from being individual and human-centered to being ecocentric collective rights and justice, including the more than human. And this demand directly disrupts the individualist ontology out of which human rights, as we know it today, was conceptualized and articulated. As Natasha and her colleagues mention in their excellent paper, human rights frameworks are based in a certain conception of human dignity or a certain worldview. And this worldview is premised upon conceptions of the individual human. And the Phoenix participants, who were Indigenous and non-Indigenous, explicitly drew from Indigenous traditions, recognizing that it is due to these traditions that the rights of nature are being introduced in places such as Ecuador and New Zealand. And as we know from Indigenous scholars and traditions, many Indigenous or relational worldviews and lifeways are organized around conceptions of the collective or relational, which inherently includes all our relations, which includes the non-human, or as I refer to, the more than human. So Santiago Uchiaj of the Shuar Nation says the concept of the human is a Western concept. And in the Shuar language, he clarifies that they do not separate out a word for human as we do in the English language. Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai-Smith urges researchers to disrupt the deference to the unit of the individual in favor of the social unit. And a Pasquet Cree scholar, Sean Wilson, shows how this shift is an ontological one. We are not individuals in relationships, we are our relationships, he says, to quote him. So this shifts thinking towards conceptions of interbeing and interconnectedness that the Phoenix youth participants feel are critical to a genuinely deep diversity. And by introducing ontological diversity and drawing on Indigenous worldviews, these young people are seeking a more radical transformation of human and children's rights towards a conception of eco-justice. And I think this is an absolutely critical way that young people are promoting a form of deep diversity and a pathway forward to what it might mean to decolonize human and children's rights. By challenging the core tenets of individualism, which is the operating logic of colonialism and its human nature binary, they are advancing an ontology or worldview of interrelationality and interconnectedness of all, which they articulate as a necessary path for advancing all of the diversity priorities that they hold. So I wanted to just follow up from this saying what happened after. Just months after the consultation in October 2021, the UN Human Rights Council passed Resolution 4813, which was the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I want to note that while this appears to step towards and meet these delegates' demands, ultimately, it doesn't reflect the ontological diversity that they were presenting and arguing for, so long as the more than human remains is something humans have a right to, rather than it having rights or justice on their own terms. We keep one of those most basic binaries and hierarchies intact. So I think it's absolutely critical for members of the children's rights communities to talk about this, not only because this is something that is being actively promoted by youth climate justice activists, but it's also a critical point of connection that brings communities focused on environmental rights and communities focused on diversity together in really important ways. And my last point is just to say, I think that the children's rights community is particularly well situated to lead the way in this transformative shift towards ontological diversity, following young people at the helm here. And I would say that this has massive significance, not just for children's rights, but for the rights sector in general. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. And I would love to pass it over to my colleague, Doris.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Kath, for hosting us. Yeah, I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples here in Ottawa, where I'm visiting with my family since September 2022. And I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to speak about reimagining children in participatory research with children. So my talk is really based on the paper that Natasha and Amy and Holly wrote. And I just want to raise various issues that really significantly relate to children's rights and their rights as knowledge holders and as knowers in the process of generating knowledge. So in your paper, Natasha and et al., you really speak to the ideas about children's participatory research on page 5, 6, and 7, and 8, and onwards. And I really want to speak to what you underscore, the importance of criticizing Eurocentric Western thinking. And I want to raise a few questions. Those of us who engage in participatory research with children, we do that because we recognize that it's important for their agency. It's important to give them a voice and a right to decision-making as enshrined in the UNCRC. We want to engage with them as a marginalized category of the population, as one of those people whose voices have really been historically silenced. So we all know that the UNCRC is really based on the Euro-Western perception of what I would call the universal child. We operate in systems that continue to ignore the differences between children from different contexts or to homogenize children. And that's where I have some concerns. And for example, I want to speak about the ethics review boards. They are usually guided by this Euro-Western thinking, Euro-Western conception of children as immature, as irrational, as at risk, who need protection, which is correct and incorrect, depending on the context. So in the interest of time, I just want to mention an example from the work I'm doing in Uganda with young people as peer researchers. So I'm doing this study in Uganda about young motherhood and how adolescents experience motherhood in Uganda, which is really a stigmatized status. And the young mothers have participated in all processes. They collected the data, they analyzed the data, they presented the data to the stakeholders. So in the process of planning the presentation, we co-created the presentation, and they were really so proud to include pictures of themselves, collecting data and doing all sorts of things. But that's where we met some criticism for breaching anonymity at some point during this process. So why when we conduct research as adults, as scholars, as researchers, we want to add our names to our work. But when young people do research, we want them to remain anonymous under the pretext of protecting them from harm. And that's partly because our participatory research protocols and guidelines are based on colonial perceptions of what's correct, what's harmful, what's child protection, and what is a child and how they should be protected, which inadvertently infringes on children's rights as knowledge holders, as knowers. And the question I want to pose here is, who determines what's harmful and what's not harmful? What if children or young people are given the right to decide for themselves what's harmful to them in participatory research processes? So what impact would that have on their rights to the knowledge that they have created? So I am really asking questions and I don't have the answers, so we can talk about that in the discussion. How can we claim to be advancing social justice, but we continue to engage in othering? And I think in the paper I read a lot of, I read something about othering, and I'm using this as a way, as something that we do when we other children as knowers. We want to collect data with them, but within limits. Their participation is exercised within limits. So I would like really to imagine ourselves as researchers, as policymakers, as students, as scholars, reimagine ourselves deconstructing and reconstructing this kind of decolonial learning. That's one thing. And also in this paper, you write about, Natasha and et al., you write about critical pedagogies and the importance of reflecting on these relationships between knowledge, authority, and power. So I really would like to invite us to reimagine doing participatory research in ways that recognize the authority and the power that we have in so many aspects. For example, as scholars working with children, from colonized communities, from children who are indigenous, children in indigenous communities, children from the global south, children from all sorts of marginalized communities. When we undertake participatory research with them, we still have the power because of, for example, we have the money, we hold the budget, we make the plans, and they fit within our plans, so we make all the decisions. And we are doing participatory research with children, but how does the power that we have as people located in the North, for example, as owners of the budget, how do all these things impact their rights to decision-making, their rights as knowers, their rights to create the knowledge that they would really like to create? I'm gonna pause here. Thank you very much. And I had an image up. I don't know if you saw it, but it was about changing the world. Like, I can change the world. If we give them the rights that they deserve, they can change the world. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to Kath.
To me.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Such rich details and discussions to move on. Depending on how we were doing with time, I was also going to present a little bit talking about particularly the role education can play in children's rights education. And I am just so impressed with the panel because we are perfectly on time. I feel a little bit disoriented by the fact that we are perfectly on time. So thank you so much, everyone. So I have been working with Doris and my colleague Shelley Jones on a project in collaboration with the International Institute of Child Rights and Development that is looking at precisely what we're talking about here, but for children's rights education in elementary school. So with the International Institute of Child Rights and Development, we have been running workshops called Child Thrive, which are in kindergarten to grade 5. We go in and share information about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and rights and responsibilities through play and arts-based activities. We have introduced that to, so we've been doing that in mainly in Victoria, but mostly in Canada, but we had introduced that into Uganda, and we have a larger project now that is particularly looking at the differences and similarities in children's rights education and what can children's rights education accomplish in these two settings. So it's interesting to listen to all 3 of the previous speakers. Some of the criticisms we have heard from other academics in presenting what we found so far and looking at children's rights education with both children in Canada and Uganda is that that we're in the wrong for doing research because we are presupposing what should be done in Uganda. And I think that that is an interesting comment from the academic world to say, why would you assume that's what's happening and that this isn't a two-way dialogue between children in grades 1 and grade 2 with children in Canada to really think through what do children's rights and responsibilities mean in these 2 different contexts. So we're further exploring that concept to really look at critical pedagogy in the early years in collaboration with young children to explore what rights are important in the language, in the culture, within the context that they're actually living. So really be critical of the systems that are in place in age-appropriate ways with these young children. And it's a fascinating project to really disentangle what we know about children's rights education and what it can be in terms of a space to really critically think about what's working, what's not, what some of the gaps are, and also to put children in conversation with one another across these contexts. So within this project that we're working on right now, we are in Greater Victoria, working with teachers, but we're also in 3 settings in Uganda, 2 sites that have large numbers of refugees and 1 southern site within Uganda. So we're building with teachers in those local communities pedagogical tools that can help support children to understand their rights, but also using play and arts-based modalities to really explore what does it mean within their context. So it supports this idea that the article has asked a number of questions. What do we actually know about the different ways children participate? This gives us a platform to actually ask those questions with children, to ask what constrains them, what supports them within the setting for education. Education, of course, is a right that is given to all children everywhere through the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but other instruments as well. It is also important to recognize that general comments have also noted that children have a right to learn about their rights. Globally, we're not particularly good at doing that. And I think we could do that more because looking at children's rights, particularly in tandem with children's responsibilities, can really support them to do the work of thinking more critically about what's important to them, how they're situated within their families, their communities, but also within their physical environment, as Rebeccah was sharing, the idea of being eco-centered, but also, as Natasha was saying, of looking at the pluriverse of children's rights and responsibilities. Next slide, please. So also wanted to ask a next question of how well are we equipped to appreciate the various ways that diverse children are participating in communities? So this is drawn from the article that we've introduced. I would say, excuse me, that we're not particularly well supported to do this, but I think we could do this better. In this image here, you see 4 images created by grade 1 and grade 2 students. On the left, you have grade 1 students in Uganda sharing what's important to them in terms of their rights. And on the left, you have grade 2 students here in Canada sharing what's important to them. The synergies between rights as they are understood by these young people, so important to think about what's similar and what's different. And there's so much space to really understand how can you have universal rights while also appreciating the intersectionality that is inherent in the lives of children and young people. And with that, I might just pause to open to the group to see if there are questions for the panel. We could probably take 1 or 2 questions. And I also, again, encourage people to link to the Padlet. The 5 questions that we have asked as panels are up there, so you can share your thoughts in the Padlet. To use a Padlet, you can just open the link, which I'll put again into the chat function. You will see in the corner, there is a little plus symbol. To use it, you just hit the plus symbol and you'll get a text box and you can add your thoughts there. So let me just pause and see if there are any questions in the chat function for the panel. And I open that to the panel as well if you have questions or comments for one another.
I wanted to ask a question. Can I just ask my question to Rebeccah? I know that, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. And I wanted to hear more about how your presentation with the youth went, because as you probably heard from mine, it was not without questions. So how did it go for you?
Thanks so much, Doris. I had a question for you too, but I'll have to pause on that and answer yours first. Sorry, do you mean my presentation? Just to clarify, you mean, so this was a 4-day consultation that was very much run by young people across Turtle Island. And then they presented to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Environment. Do you mean, how did that presentation go when they presented? Yeah, so this is really the point of disconnect that I wanted to, I did want to flag and highlight, because they were absolutely heard by the UN Special Rapporteur, very receptive, who also attended part of the consultation. It's wonderful. But I feel like one of the things that's really missing is genuine long-term mechanisms and processes by which there's a dialogue happening and a partnership happening between young people and adults in different institutions, where there's also equity of power. One of the things that delegates talked about quite a lot, actually, in the Phoenix consultation was feeling like they were poster children without any decision-making power. And, you see these big billboards of Greta Thunberg, on buildings, and, it does, the reality is young people are listened to and heard, but that doesn't always mean that the diverse perspectives and opinions they're bringing are genuinely being integrated. And so that's why I wanted to point out that this resolution, I think for many in the rights community, seemed like a response and addressing the concerns put forward by young people. But I'm trying to point out that this ontological diversity is really not being captured there. And so if we want to empower young people, like you were saying, in all of these ways, including owning their own research and being able to, I do think we have to talk about what this kind of partnership could look like moving forward. So I think they were happy to be heard, and yet it's the lack of these ongoing mechanisms and genuine equitable partnerships, including being compensated in different ways, that would also, I think, be very valued by the group of young people.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Maybe can I say comment? I would say that it strikes me like I loved hearing, Rebeccah, Kathleen, you talked about the value of dialogue and these spaces that have been created in terms of cross-cultural, international, global, and really putting it to the young people, and how some really interesting things are emerging. You talked about the ontological diversity and so forth. But how do we move forward is kind of my big question that Kathleen, you said, and I think it's really about reaching out across sectors and building partnerships. Doris, you talked about the needs for working with the ethics boards. I mean, who are part of these ethics boards at universities? They're all people from different disciplines that need to be raise their awareness. So I see that it's really being strategic, and how do we work across these disciplines and across different levels of power, because ultimately I think power for me stands out as a really important issue that we need to tackle with, that I think we haven't tackled with enough in the child rights field.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree, Natasha. And I think if I remember correctly, we may have been in a similar session a few years ago where we were doing exactly that at a conference in Europe, talking about how can we progress ethics boards to think more creatively and fulsomely about children's participation within research. So I agree. I think it is really important that we do that within our channels across the group. We do have quite a few other questions. Does anyone else want to make a comment on that before I share some of these questions?
I just wanted to actually ask Doris a question around that point very briefly, is how did that issue get resolved in the case of the young people wanting to be recognized and it being a challenge within ethics? And where are you at with that currently in your research?
Thank you very much. The question is not coming from the ethics committee per se, but coming from like the participants, the audience. Why is it that you are revealing the identity of this youth? So it's not coming from the ethics review board, but of course it's an unresolved issue, because I personally would love to include them on all the reports that we have written as a result of this process, but I'm now tempted to go back to the ethics committee to get permission to do that. Yeah, so it's not yet resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. As we continue our dialogue and moving forward and pushing for change, that's a great example. Thank you. We have questions coming from multiple angles, so let me just ask this one from well, actually, there's one that's similar both in the chat and in the Padlet. How can we include children with neurodiversities to regular conventional school systems using these policies? How can we use a rights-based lens to more clearly include neurodiverse students? Any thoughts?
I'll jump in if I think this is where we really have to start talking about, decolonizing education systems in general, and what that means. And in terms of also the methods of teaching and the methods of engagement, which really historically colonial knowledge systems and education systems have prioritized and devalued certain forms of knowing. And so I think, the more that we see arts-based approaches, but also student or youth-centered approaches where they actually get to determine and define how they express and share and engage and learn, and building curriculum and courses around that, starting from young people and letting them take the leadership in that process. But I think exploding the ways that, so nature-based approaches, arts-based approaches, relational approaches. And I think there's many really interesting authors that talk about decolonizing pedagogies and teaching methods in the classroom. And for me, I think that addresses a whole range of diversity issues in important ways, including neurodiverse.
I have to agree. And that's what we are doing within our project, is trying to ensure that we are using a lot of different modalities to include a range of students, including those who are neurodiverse. So that was beautifully said. Thank you, Rebeccah. The next question is is in a similar ilk, but any thoughts on how projects mentions also include children with special needs or abandoned children? While you pause to think about that, I will just also suggest that we've recently completed and just had published some of the work that we have done in collaboration, again, with the International Institute of Child Rights and Development and UNICEF to speak to children with disabilities from around the world, really focused on listening to their voices and what they thought the international community needed to know about including their voices. And it was probably one of the most informative projects I've been on in a long time, which just really reiterated the importance of talking to and with and leading with children themselves, because they have so many insights to share and so much clear knowledge about the context that they're actually living in, the impediments that they're facing. So it's a big question, but that's one thought I would have. Anyone want to add?
I think you have said it all, but yeah, because what happens most of the time is that we want to think what's best for them, want to think on their behalf and not give them an opportunity to engage and tell us or tell whoever is engaging them what is the best way forward, or what would be in their best interest. We want to assume that we know what's in their best interest, which is like the same as what you said. So we need to be proactive in terms of giving them the voice to speak for themselves.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And I mean, I would just add, I think it really supports a need for like decolonizing like education as a whole, and a certain view that what is the normality. Like, I think that's also being impacted by colonialism and Eurocentric views that, people who are have different ways of thinking is not as good as another way of thinking. So I think I would encourage us in decolonizing to really question, not just focus on let's meet neurodiverse, let's meet everybody to be more inclusive and move away from a view that there's certain knowledge, certain intelligence to privilege more than others. And I think that's where we're encouraging to revisit the way that traditional societies or other societies don't have such a dichotomous view of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is better, and to be more inclusive of those different forms of knowledge and doing. And that's something that I think what decolonizing is about. It's a long journey, and there's a lot of work to be done in that way at all levels. But
beautiful. I think possibly I have time for 2 more questions, and Danielle has patiently been waiting there, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. Am I on mute? Can you hear me? Awesome. I'm so happy to be here. This is great, and all the panelists and everything are so informative. And thank you. I'm super excited that Kathleen Manion is here. It's been a few years. My question is about recognizing all of the learning that's happening in these incredible reports that are coming in, and knowing that we have to inspire and empower children to be lead us. I really believe that. And what can we do in the way of connecting all of what we know here in this room to the work that maybe we're doing in the front line. In my work, yeah, we know these things, but even yesterday, decolonization is part of a debate in my workplace. It's not a thing we're actually doing. The programs that are funded in education and in parent support programs are highly Eurocentric and very focused on, the binary worldview. And it's really, really difficult when you learn these kind of things and then you're there and it's kind of an emotional load. And what I'm finding is even like the great path towards using any of the, calls for justice or the calls for action, they're all there. These recommendations are there. It's written for us. It's there. But the institutions are pushing back so hard. So like, I'm a little shaky just talking because this room is full, and I'm just hoping that maybe we could talk more about how to bridge those conversations and support parents and caregivers and frontline workers that are in the know, that really want to learn more, but are getting this incredible pushback. And so it feels like, how do we move legislation? How do we get policies in place? And how do we get these reports heard? So what can we do on the front line to bring your work to parents and to the front line? That's what I would like to know.
That's a big question, Danielle. Anyone who want to jump in? I would say that is a challenge. We, as researchers, are working all the time on reports and articles like this. Knowledge dissemination is always a challenge, particularly getting to the right audience. We're pretty good at disseminating amongst ourselves, but we're already converted. So
yeah, that's it, right? Yeah, how do we move the needle forward to get this information even to children? And, that's my big challenge. So I'm on it, but I'd love to collaborate.
I want to just say thanks for that big question. We need to be asking big questions. And I see there's not a whole lot of time for us to talk about it too much more today, but I think the more spaces we have where we are able to share that across sectors, disciplines, as Natasha was mentioning, that's really helpful, and start, collating like, effective experiences, good practices. When has this worked? Some of the inspiring success stories, like I think those kinds of spaces would be really helpful. And I also just wanted to say, I really truly do believe that the means are the end. So the more that we can be introducing genuinely participatory and equitable methods of engagement and dialogue into all spaces, and multi-log, really, I believe that really is a way that shifts can start to happen long term. So just actually living and being the change that we're hoping to enact, I think, at both the level of individual action, but also at the institutional levels. So pushing our institutions to shift in those ways, in structural ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that we're just about out of time, so I am just going to wrap up some of the key words that I've heard here. I'm going to give a couple of minutes back to Nancy at the very end, but throughout this beautiful discussion, thank you so much, panel, talking about the importance of decolonizing our learning, looking at systems and structures with a critical lens, ensuring that we're looking at the multiple identities and intersectionality of the children we're working with, and ensuring we're really pushing those participatory processes so that we are hearing from a broad range of children, so that we can start to push back against the homogenized children, as Doris said, but also within the context of eco-centered understanding of the world. I would invite everyone to just put a word of something in the chat function here, one word that you're going to take forward from this session. And I'm going to just also ask the panel to share one word from today's session, and then I'll hand it back to Nancy. Natasha.
Power. Share the power.
Beautiful. Rebeccah.
Invigorated. I'm feeling invigorated from this dialogue, and I hope we have more.
Great. Doris.
I'd like to say non-discrimination.
Beautiful. Oh, with that, well, I will say diversity. And I will also hand it back to Nancy just for the last few minutes. But thank you so much, everyone. This has been fantastic.
What a great conversation. Thank you, everyone. I'm just trying to share my screen again here. And here we go. And yeah, I just posted in the chat, and maybe if some people want to stay a few more minutes and just ask us questions, please do so. But the program that Kathleen is the program head of, the graduate certificate in child protection and well-being, I would imagine that this is where the conversation can continue. So we have one intake per year for that program, and you see that the intake is starting in May. So you still have a bit of time if you want to apply to it and join that online program that is about 9 months online. I saw that maybe you have a field trip coming in 2023 or 2024. So very exciting program here. And Kathleen, I think you talk about your work in a very beautiful way. And I'm just like curious, as many of us, many people in the chat were asking me about the program. So here it is, deadline May 1st. You can apply already today if you want to, if you're getting excited. You can also connect with our enrollment services. Quick email, learn.more@railroads.ca. They're here to support. They can do a Zoom call with you. You can ask all the questions you have. And we know that going back to school is a huge component of our life, the financial aspect of it. So feel free to reach out to our financial aid and award, and I'll make sure to share those links with you with the recording. And yeah, thank you. I think, Kathleen, you asked for one last word, so I'm looking in the chat, and we'll send you the recording in the next 24 hours. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the conversation. Thank you to the panelists. I think it's a much needed conversation, and I think we can talk about it all day.
Beautiful. And I just want to apologize that we didn't get to all of your questions. I've thrown my email up there. If you want to continue a conversation, please do reach out to me. But once again, thank you so much to the panel.
Thank you, Kathleen and Nancy, for all your work organizing, bringing us together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.